Welcome to Season 4 of Community Chats and to our special Belonging series, where we're going to take the next 6 episodes through May, June, and July and really dive into what belonging means to many of the people that are connected with our community. As part of Community Living Month and our We All Belong campaign, we'll be speaking with guests from across the community about experiences, relationships, and the moments that help create a sense of belonging. This is our second year of the We All Belong campaign, and we're really encouraged with the support that people have shown and for the importance that people are placing on belonging. For our first episode, we have a conversation with David Lepofsky. Well known to many of us, he is a great advocate and supporter. David shares his early experiences of belonging and how it inspired him to take action that allows many people to legally belong today. I now bring you David Lepofsky. All right, David Lepofsky, nice to see you again. Thanks for joining us today.
Always delighted to take part.
Yeah, you're keeping well?
In one piece.
Excellent. This has got to be the longest introduction to spring, summer that I can remember for a long, long time.
Kind of an early fall, but we'll take it.
Whatever. It's getting warmer by the day. We should be optimists.
Yep.
You have the privilege, and we're grateful for you for joining our first podcast on belonging. We're doing a whole series talking to different people around what belonging means to you to complement our We All Belong campaign that we've started a year ago. So thanks for being our first guest.
I'm happy to be included in belonging.
Excellent. Why don't we start off with? I mean, you've got always got a lot going on. So maybe I'll just start off by before we get into talking about your thoughts on belonging. What's new with you? What's going on? What's interesting?
Well, the biggest issue that I've been involved in recently is the provincial government's Bill 101, which is a major provincial takeover of school boards. They're leaving school elected trustees in place, but as a shadow of their former selves. And I've been involved with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, which I chair, and a number of other disability organizations, excuse me, focusing on the harms that this threatens for students with disabilities. And just as one illustration that really typifies it, the provincial government and ministries will come up with these brash, bold new policies without thinking about their impact on people with disabilities. And we suffer the consequences. So one of the things that happened in trying to market this major provincial takeover is that the Minister of Education, Paul Calandra, said, there's a huge problem that not enough students in high school are attending school, so we want to attack this absenteeism crisis. And the solution is that they're going to penalize students who are absent.
They're going to tie it to the academic grade. Yeah.
Now, aside from the fact that it doesn't target any of the problems that cause absenteeism, if you want to solve a problem, you don't muzzle the symptom. You address the causes, but set that aside. This immediately presented for students with disabilities. So, for example, any number of students with disabilities would like to go to school, but their principals refuse to let them go, either for the full day or at all. And the provincial government hasn't addressed that problem, where they're the cause of the absenteeism. Right. But the minister was asked, well, what about that? And he said, making it up as he goes along, he said, well, we'll exempt students with special education needs from this rule, but didn't think about the consequences that would have for students with disabilities. When I was before Parliament, the legislature a week ago, the day we're recording this on the 27th of April, I said, this is like trying to cure stomach flu by saying we'll duct tape the patient's mouth shut, right? It may suppress the symptom.
That's quite the visual, yeah.
It doesn't really cure anything, and it's actually quite awful, aside from all of the rest. But in this case, if they adopted that kind of rule, can you imagine this as a new source of bullying of students with disabilities? in the schoolyard, students without disabilities. Why do you get higher grades? Because you don't have to be at school, and we get penalized if we're
Oh,
not, and
right.
that's not fair. And that kind of bullying, we don't need another cause for
And
bullying
it gets
students with disabilities.
it gets away from that point of equity, right? Where
Yeah.
you're creating a special education regime within the public system. Is that another unintended consequence or potential
Well,
consequence
it's
from that approach?
it's just creating another. It's adopting a rule without thinking about the impact on students with disabilities.
Right.
And then when they're confronted with the impact, i.e., exclusions, they come up with another rule, which is even more harmful for students with disabilities. This is what we've been up against, and so that's been a major thing. Now the government pushed forward the bill and rammed it through, and by the time this recording goes public, I expect the law will have passed on third reading. Um, but in the meantime, both the opposition parties proposed some amendments at our request, amendments that would require the government to take into account the impact on people with disabilities when the provincial government starts trying to manage the minutia at school boards around the province. Well, the government voted against that. They shouldn't have to
Right.
take into account the impact on students with disabilities. The government's taken over being able to dictate the minutia if there's any construction at schools, renovations or new alterations. So we said we proposed, got an amendment proposed that said they should make sure that those construction projects are accessible to people with disabilities, parents and kids.
Right.
Well, the government voted against that.
Right.
That's where we live.
So you've got a lot keeping you busy. And you've also got a podcast. We can talk about that a little bit later, but maybe just to start, you are known as a strong advocate for disability issues. Um, you're very passionate about the work that you do, and have had a significant impact over many decades on how we live in Canada and how people with disabilities live. So you deserve a lot of recognition for that and a lot of credit. The, this sort of month, we're focusing on belonging and what that means to different people. So you are blind and have been so for many years. Can you talk about what that was like as a child growing up and as a young adult, and you going through school? You've become a lawyer. You've gone through a big journey. How did belonging fit in, or what was your experience in belonging?
Well, I had an experience when I was 13 and I went to an overnight camp in the States, not a camp for blind kids. It was a Jewish educational summer camp that really defines my understanding of this. You see, as I'm totally blind now, but when I was a kid, I had partial vision in one eye. And I could read, but I had to hold a book up close to my nose. Now, if I was reading in a public place, like a park or a shopping mall or a restaurant, somebody would come over, adult or kid, and say, my parent, why don't you get better glasses for your kid? As if this had never occurred to us. Um, my condition couldn't be corrected by glasses. So I was used to being kind of the weird kid for that reason. Well, I went to this summer camp, and the first night we were all getting into bed, the campers, and I always liked reading before I go to bed, even when I was 13. And so I took out a novel to read, and I held it up close to my nose, and I was just waiting for the teasing to start from the other kids because I just met them. They knew I had low vision, but I
Right.
didn't use a white cane. Nobody said a word, and nobody teased me. And my first reaction is, I can remember I'm 13, is what's wrong with these kids? Like, why am I not being teased?
Right.
Well, what I was later to find out was that they had spoken to the campers in my bunk while I was out of the cabin and explained that I had low vision and that they should accept me as an equal. And this was the first time ever that I had met a bunch of new kids and didn't get teased. And I realized from this event as a 13-year-old that we can have a belonging community, but it doesn't happen by accident. It only happens when you got a camp director and staff who are visionary enough to do this. Now, what I'm describing happened in 1970. We'd expect a lot more today in 2026, but that was pretty forward thinking. And my understanding since then has always been that I can't just expect people who don't know anything about blindness to treat me as an equal, much as I'd like to be. That I've got to sort of regularly be in this process of advocating in order to win that opportunity. Now, is that the way the world should be? No. But is it the way the world was when I grew up? And the answer is absolutely.
So that's a really great story. And so did you find out about the sort of orientation that the camp director had done with your cabin mates while you were at the camp, or was that down the
No,
road?
I think I found it. I don't remember when I found out, but I think it was at that time. I've since been back to the camp many times, but I've been back
Right.
to teach future next generations of campers. And I tell this story, how it really started me on a road that I'm still on here, so many years later.
Were you appreciative of them doing that on your behalf, or how did you
Oh,
receive it at the
no.
time?
I would listen. I was 13. I was
Yeah.
delighted.
Okay.
I found that camp to be a home where I could feel like I belonged. Look, one of the activities was sports. I stink at sports, but there were other activities I excelled at, and everybody got the chance to be, what they could be in the areas they could be it in. And I still have very good friends all around the world that I met at that camp at that time.
So that there's something there that around belonging, and that experience that you had as a young kid. Well, yeah, 13. I guess that's
Hmm.
uh, a young boy. How's that shaped you and your expectations, and I guess your advocacy since then?
Well, it very much shaped my understanding that we can accomplish a belonging community. We can accomplish a community, and it's actually not that hard if the people in charge make it part of the plan and make it part of the DNA.
Right.
Our problem and why I've been involved along with so many other people, when you talked about accomplishments, these are all the products of lots of people teaming up together, and I'm honored to be one of them. But whether it's at the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Toronto District School Board, which I'm now chairing, or
Hmm.
or through these other efforts, it's actually trying to push the people who could create those environments to create those environments, because they won't happen by accident.
Great. The so that happened in 1970 and you're 13. Fast forward 10, 12 years, you're a young man, a young lawyer involved with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and you took a strong role in that. Can you talk about what you did there and how did belonging inform your approach to that effort?
Well, in 1980, our then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau proposed a new charter, a new constitution with a new charter of rights, first time ever. And it included a new guarantee of equality. All of this is great, but the equality provision did not include people with disabilities. And I had just finished law school. I was writing my bar exams. I thought this was appalling. But I didn't have much experience. I had very little experience doing community organizing. And I got involved in advocating. I needed a platform. So I used the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, to appear in Ottawa before a parliamentary committee to argue for the disability amendment. Two other organizations did it, the precursor to the Council of Canadians with Disabilities
Mhm.
and the precursor to community, Inclusion Canada. It was then called
Yeah.
the Canadian Association for the Men. One of the people who
Right.
presented. I was later to meet, befriend, and admire Orville Endicott,
Hmm.
And I still miss him to this day as a
Yeah, yeah.
tremendous advocate for people with intellectual disabilities and a role model to me and a gem of a human being. I've written a memoir about that battle, which any of our listeners can read for free. I don't want people to have to pay. If you just search on the title on the internet, search on Swimming Up Niagara Falls. I called it that because it felt like we were trying to swim up Niagara Falls. And you could download it as a Word document, a PDF, an EPUB, or an audiobook, all for free. If you really want a hard copy,
It's a good
go to
deal.
Amazon and search on Swimming Up Niagara Falls, and they charge, I think, $17 to print a copy.
Okay. Oh,
And I don't get royalties because I don't want to. I want you to be able to read it, but it tells you can read what each of the presenters had to say. But what I learned from that was that doing what seemed objectively impossible, fighting to get an amendment to the Constitution itself. Um, Not alone, there was a number of us who were involved in the fight, but we weren't connected. We were all operating separately. We didn't have an internet. We didn't have Zoom. We didn't have Twitter, social media, any of that stuff.
right.
But like we won. And even though it seems as impossible as to try to swim up Niagara Falls, we did swim up Niagara Falls. And we've got an amendment to the Charter of Rights, which is still in force today.
Do,
So
is there a moment that stands out when you sort of, so you learn about this, you study, you go do your presentations, you align with other people that are advocating for the same thing. There must have been a moment we found out, wow, we've won. What was that
I
like?
talk about it in the memoir. It's actually very funny. It turns out that the justice minister at the time was a guy named Jean Chrétien, who went on to be prime minister.
Yeah.
And he had a guy working in his office, a policy advisor named Eddie Goldenberg. I had met him the year before when I was doing my law apprenticeship. It's called articling, and he was in the firm. When I appeared in Ottawa, he came over to say hi to me, and it only occurred to me at the end of January of 1981, I should lobby this guy. Which in the memoir I explained, like I feel like a complete jerk for not calling him sooner. But
Right.
I called him on a particular morning, and I was all ready with my 58 arguments why they should agree with us. And he goes, David, it's going to pass today.
Oh,
We'd
wow.
won. And then he said, and don't tell anyone. So I have to walk around all day knowing we'd won this stupendous victory collectively. And I can't tell anyone. By the way, I'm convinced I told my mom.
Well, your mom was one of your biggest supporters, so, or maybe your biggest supporter at that time. So she'd earned it.
Yeah, but
That's
and by the way, we're going to talk about my podcast, but we have two episodes in the podcast about that battle where I interview
oh, okay.
one of the other combatants who worked on it back then, who I didn't
Oh,
know
great.
back then, but I've met since.
So I've listened to some of your podcasts, but I haven't heard that one. So I will tune in. That's fascinating because those were uphill battles. But it sounds like when you're getting the nod from somebody in the Minister of Justice's office that you've been successful. That must have been very emboldening for what you have continued to do since then around advocacy and challenging the status quo and fighting uphill battles or upstream battles, as it were.
Absolutely. And, our biggest impediment to success is not governments that won't listen or school board senior bureaucrats who are just bureaucrats,
Right.
and so on. Those are real problems. But our biggest obstacle to success is the fact that so many people with disabilities and their allies feel there's nothing they can do. And I'm not saying that feeling is unfounded or that they're
Right.
irrational. I get it. You have to suspend that disbelief. You have to suspend the feeling that you can't swim up Niagara Falls.
Right.
And then you go do this advocacy. And that's what the podcast is all about, because probably everybody I've interviewed stared at that waterfall and said, "Tell with it, I'm going."
Yeah. Yeah. So since then, and that's what, Jesus, that 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago, that's going
Yeah,
back. Um,
46.
46. where are we at now? Where are we at now in terms of people? And I'll separate them into two categories: the rights that people with a disability have, and then just what's your general sense of where we're at in terms of belonging and acceptance of people with disabilities in Canada.
It's cliche to say, well, we've come a long way, but there's still much to be done. God, if we had a buck for every time we've heard that, we'd be retiring the national debt and you wouldn't have to do any more fundraising campaigns. Um, and I wish we could, but um, in terms of rights in the law books, we are significantly ahead between what's guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and in provincial and federal human rights codes. We have a provincial in Ontario accessibility legislation, the Accessibility for
Mm-hmm.
Ontarians with Disabilities Act. We have the Accessible Canada Act. Both of those have been achieved far less than they could. And but as a result of our campaigning and the advocacy, we have a new generation of people with disabilities and their allies, their parents, their family members, their spouses, who see us as rights holders. In the 70s, we were charity recipients. If you said disability, they reached in their wallet to give you a handout.
Right.
Okay, that was the association. And if you talk to a news reporter, it was, oh, what's the terrible story about what it's like to live with your disability? Or let's do a heartwarming story how, despite your disability, blah, 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 right? As if your life
Right.
should be miserable. So if you overcame that misery, oh, that's so heartwarming.
The
Um,
the term I've used or I've heard and used at times to describe that is sadvertising.
I mean, there's no end to this, but I'm teaching at part-time at 3 law schools. They have 20 to 30% of their student population registers having disabilities. And I mean the full
Wow.
spectrum of disabilities. And any number of them aren't just in it because of disability rights, but they sure have a keen interest, either career interest or personal interest in disability rights. When I went to law school, nobody said the word disability and the word rights in the same sentence.
Right.
Okay. We didn't study this in law school at all. We didn't even think about it. It wasn't a thing.
Right.
So to that end, we've come a distance. I will say the following, however. We have generated way less, way more in defining rights and way less at implementing rights. And so we aren't seeing the progress. I measure Canada and Ontario based not on where we've come, but where we could be given who
Right.
we are and what we have. And given who we are and what we have in terms of resources, capacity, we are way behind where we should be and
So with the
inexcusably.
yeah, with the AODA, so that's the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act.
Yep.
And there's also a similar there's a piece of legislation similar in the United States.
Yep. The
How do we
Americans with
how do
Disabilities Act.
Americans ADA? So um, how do we compare to what they've done in the States? Have they been more successful or less successful
Okay.
or
Disability advocates would say they're far behind where they should be, but I will tell you that our act actually defines rights better than theirs.
does it?
But their act has done tons more change because the implementation, the enforcement, the regulatory powers have been used and are more robust.
Even just small things like I worked for years in the deaf community, and I always note that when a politician is doing an announcement, whether it's they're running for office or they're announcing a hurricane, there is a sign language interpreter on the stage right next to them interpreting what is being said. You rarely see that in Canada. And I just naively attribute that to just more adoption um, the Americans with Disabilities Act at having more teeth or more acceptance
Yeah,
than it does here. Is that uh,
I think that's
too naive, or is that
no, no, no. I think that's fair. I mean, listen, I'm going to give you one that may seem like silly. It's so obvious. But when you, as a sighted person, check into a hotel, how do you know what room you're in? There's a number on the door. How do I know
yes?
what room I'm in? You'd think, well, having Braille? That doesn't cost much. You put it up once and it's done. You go to an American hotel and you'll almost always, I'm trying to remember if I've ever been to one in my adult life when they didn't have Braille on the door for a room number. In a Canadian hotel, you will virtually only see it if it's an American chain. And you only
Right.
have it in that American chain because the US Congress had required the corporation to do it, so it's part of their standard practice. So, in other words, we get more accessibility when it comes to Braille on the hotel room doors, which cost pennies. We get more
Right.
from Queen's Park.
I forget where I was with you, but we were going to get in an elevator. And it was one of these new ones. I guess they're trying to manage the flow of people going up
They're called
elevators. So,
destination elevators.
okay, there you go. And you have to go up and push the floor you're on, and then it'll tell you, or not tell you, show you what elevator to get in. And you had sort of pointed out that that wasn't really helpful for you, and there was no way around it.
They are horrible for accessibility, but everybody hates them. Nobody knows how to use them.
Sure.
They took
No.
technology that actually everybody knows how to use an elevator and came up with something that's more complicated and people don't know how to use. And aside from being horrible for accessibility and confusing for everybody, they're also dangerous. And why are
Right.
they dangerous? Because if you go on one, you can't press a button on a floor and just say, I want to get off right now.
I want to
You
get
got to wait
off.
till it goes to the floor. So if a
All right.
woman
Good
gets
point.
on
Good point.
an elevator or a teen gets on an elevator and there's some guy there who looks kind of creepy, the first instinct for self-protection is get off the elevator. You
Right.
can't. If the next stop is the 30th floor, you're trapped. That's a
Yeah,
safety
there.
thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had not thought of that as I've used those, or once I figured out. I'm just so relieved to be on it and going to the right place, I hope. Um,
Yep.
so that's good reflection on where we're at and where we've got to go. Now you've started a podcast where you're focusing on these issues and other of your favorite topics. Tell us about it.
So I'm inviting your listeners of your podcast to listen to my podcast and to invite others to do the same because the only way you learn about podcasts is word of mouth. It's called Disability Rights and Wrongs, the David Lepodcast. On it, I explained that I'm named after the podcast rather than the podcast being named after me. And the idea that I had was nobody tells our stories from an advocacy perspective. And I wanted to take you, the listener, to the front lines of disability advocacy, to hear the stories of people who are fighting the good fight. And I don't mean professionals, though some of them are. And I don't mean people in organizations, though some of them are, and totally appropriately good to hear from them. But I want you to hear from individuals and hear what they were up against, how they got involved, what they did, how well it worked, and in every episode, what can we learn? I want you, the listener, to learn how to do advocacy. And that advocacy doesn't have to be legislative advocacy or policy reform. It could be how to advocate for your kids' disability needs at school.
Right.
Spoiler alert, we got a couple episodes on that topic coming.
I bet.
And so I've interviewed an advocate for air travel accessibility, who's been
Mhm.
up against Bayan Ziv, who's had horrible experiences, but is catapulted in the front of efforts for reform. I interviewed just recently, the latest episode is Kate Chung, who's an advocate for accessible housing, especially important for seniors, but for everybody. We've read about the battles in the media for kids with autism in Ontario.
Right.
One of the architects of that battle talked about having two kids with autism, not knowing anything about that or advocacy, and ending up co-building an amazing movement that is all over the news and has had a dramatic impact. But it's not just hearing, in terms of the constitutional reform, I interviewed Yvonne Peters, a lawyer I met years after those battles, who was doing the same thing in Saskatchewan that I was doing in Ontario when we were both much younger, fighting for that amendment. We compare notes.
Right.
But the other thing, and so I'm trying to cover all disabilities, all barriers. That's why I've got lots to cover. But the other thing I wanted to do, if I want you to learn how to do this advocacy, um, and learn from successes and failures, I thought it would be also good to hear from people from the other side of the desk, the
Right.
people to whom you advocate.
Right.
So, two things that we've done so far. I wanted to talk to a politician, for a retired politician who I'd lobbied. Well, I really was fortunate because I got Kathleen Wynne, former Premier of
Hmm.
Ontario, gave such a great interview that I actually, we split it into two episodes
Oh, great.
because it's so rich with content. And we were able to talk, like, I met her lobbying her, and now we just have a collegial relationship. But I asked her, what works? How do you get a meeting with a premier? What gets your attention? And we actually talked about meetings we'd had or issues we'd locked horns on, and did kind of a Monday morning quarterback analysis of years later, which was fantastic. She was just
Right.
great. But also, one of the things we talk about is take your issue to the media. Well, I've been in the media a lot, but lots of people haven't. So I want to talk to a former journalist about how to get a story in the media. Well, I got a fantastic woman who's a friend of mine named Michelle McQuigg. She was at Canadian Press for 20 years.
Hmm.
She's blind, and she's now the head of Balance for Blind Adults. It's a service providing organization. I'd taken stories to her to see if she would cover them. That's how I met her.
Right.
And she talked about what it takes to get a story in the media, what the do's and don'ts, and gave a really practical guide to someone who's never done it before, about what you should do.
That's
Um,
great.
so I want to give you, we have an episode upcoming which will be of special interest to Community Living Toronto, a community who have
Hmm.
kids in school, because I wanted to talk about how to advocate. And we've got a couple episodes that'll be upcoming, but we've recorded one already. It's a few weeks away before it'll come out. But I interviewed a now retired elementary school principal. And I said, if my child has disability related needs, how do I raise it with you? Who do I talk to? What works? If I'm not happy with what's going on, what do I do? Not chapter and verse of board procedures,
Right.
but dealing with people. And the principal, now retired, who I interviewed, knows the story from both sides because she also has a kid with a disability.
Oh, okay. That would be an interesting conversation.
So we've got that already. And I'm open, by the way, if people want to write me with ideas of what else we should cover.
Right. Well,
I welcome feedback, and I welcome ideas. Our
yeah, no,
email is
it's a good podcast, and we'll put some link. We'll put a link to it in the notes for this as well. So I'm glad you're doing that. I wondered how long it would take you to get into the podcast space, and you did not disappoint. Um, uh, Final question for you: in all of your years of doing advocacy um, and your personal experiences in that, is there? And this is probably an impossible question. However, is there a moment or something that stands out in all your years that sort of made it that sort of you go back to and think, this is why I do this work. This is why this matters.
there are lots of those moments, but I'll tell you um, what really resonates for me. When I see or get an email from someone who is advocating for themselves or their child or their parent, and they've been following our updates or watch one of our videos, we have tons, or now listening to the podcast. If someone sees those and turns it into action, that for me is what I get a wall-to-wall smile. And I actually, it's great. When the podcast started, we said, please email us, give us your feedback, AODA feedback at gmail.com.
Right.
And someone I'd never heard of blasted me. Why did you interview Kathleen when you were so critical of her? This is just hypocritical. And I wrote back and I said, look, we were critical of her, but she's giving us helpful tips. and she was very generous, and I think the tips were useful. Well, that person then listened to the next podcast and then emailed me saying, I'm going to use these tips. I wish I'd known this before. And I just got this grin that you can't believe. Like, I was delighted that they listened to the podcast. I'm delighted that they listened critically and were ready to poke at me because they should.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and I'm delighted that when I responded, and Kathleen Wynne, I could criticize things she should have done, but she's done a lot of stuff that was good for us, and she was so generous with her time.
Well, and
Um,
you don't get to be premier without knowing a thing or two about politics, and how to understand and explain an issue. So you're right. We have to see people that we're talking with and advocating for things from as people and humans that are that we can learn stuff from as well. We're missing out if we don't.
And I also I get a big smile and I am really delighted if somebody reads one of our updates and says, I don't agree with you. And here's why, because engaging people who sit at home and watch TV and just feel it's hopeless. I understand that mentality. I've
Yeah.
been there. But my goal is to get them from just yelling at their computer screen or their TV screen to jumping into action.
Get up and
And
advocate.
Yep. And once they do, we can win constitutional reform. We can win changes at school boards. We can win legislative reforms. The sky's the limit. And
David, you're one.
that's what the podcast's for, to give you the
Yeah,
tools.
well, it's the podcast and it's what you've done throughout your life. So you are no better representative of that truth that if you get up and start working with like-minded people, you can change the world.
Well, it's an honor to be able to do this stuff and to work with so many wonderful people like you, like your organization, like so many others that I've met, who, allow it to happen because one person alone can't.
True. David, thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time. Again, you will encourage people to listen to your podcast. And again, thanks for taking some time this afternoon to share your thoughts. And thank you for everything that you've done for the disability community and for so many people over for so many years.
Thanks for involving me and thanks for your friendship.
Thank you for listening, watching, and sharing. We release a new episode of Community Chats on the 15th and the 30th of each month, so don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date.